In 1932, a box of macaroni could mean the difference between eating and going to bed hungry. It sat on pantry shelves beside little else. No meat, no fresh vegetables, no certainty about tomorrow. Families learned to turn that single box into something more than just food. They mixed it with whatever was left, whatever was cheap, whatever nobody else thought to use. Some of those combinations sound strange now. Ketchup in place of tomatoes, milk poured where sauce should be, even beans and noodles sharing the same pot. But these weren't recipes written in cookbooks. They were decisions made at the stove with empty cupboards and hungry children waiting. And somehow, they worked. Tonight, we're going back to those forgotten pasta dinners, one bowl at a time. Number 1, macaroni and ketchup. In the middle of the 1930s, there were nights when a proper tomato sauce simply wasn't an option. Fresh tomatoes spoiled too quickly, and canned ones cost more than many families could spare. But a small bottle of ketchup sat quietly on the table, already paid for, already open. So it became dinner. A pot of elbow macaroni would boil on the stove until soft, then be drained and returned to the same warm pot. A few spoonfuls of ketchup were stirred in, sometimes with a bit of fat if there was any left from earlier meals. The color turned a pale red, almost pink, coating every piece just enough to feel like something more than plain pasta. It worked because it filled the gap. Sweet, tangy, and familiar, it convinced children they were eating something complete. This was the meal that showed up when cupboards were nearly empty and payday hadn't arrived yet. Number 2, bacon grease spaghetti. There was almost always a small tin near the stove, quietly collecting what others might have thrown away. Bacon grease, saved from breakfasts long gone, was never wasted. It was too valuable for that. On certain evenings, that tin became the entire flavor of supper. Spaghetti would be cooked until tender, then poured straight into a hot pan where a spoonful of that saved grease waited. The heat melted it instantly, slipping into every strand. Sometimes a bit of garlic found its way in, sometimes not. Most times, it was just salt, pepper, and what that grease already carried with it. It worked because nothing needed to be bought. The richness was already there, stored from another meal, stretched into this one. The smell was deep and smoky, filling small kitchens with something that felt heavier than it really was. This was the kind of dinner made without planning, just memory and habit. Number 3, noodles with cottage cheese. There were moments when meat was gone, eggs were scarce, and even butter had to be measured carefully. But dairy, simple, unfashionable dairy, sometimes lingered in the icebox a little longer than anything else. Cottage cheese was one of those things people didn't reach for first, which is exactly why it was still there. A pot of wide noodles would be cooked soft, then turned out into a bowl while still steaming. A scoop of cottage cheese was folded in, not melted completely, just warmed enough to soften at the edges. If there was a bit of butter, it went in. If not, the noodles carried it on their own. It worked because it added substance without cost, protein without meat, a quiet kind of nourishment. The texture was unusual, creamy in places, firm in others, but it was filling in a way that stayed with you. In many immigrant kitchens, this wasn't considered strange at all. It was simply what you made when there was enough to get by. Number 4, macaroni with peas. There were evenings when the goal wasn't to be clever. It was simply to get something on the table before the light faded and the children grew restless. 2 cans in the cupboard could solve that problem faster than anything else. One of macaroni, one of peas. The macaroni would cook quickly, bubbling away while the peas waited their turn. Then everything went together, peas, liquid and all, mixed into the pasta with whatever small bit of fat could be spared. Nothing was drained twice, nothing was wasted. It worked because it was fast and dependable, a full pot in minutes, using only what was already there. The peas brought a soft sweetness, breaking up the plainness of the noodles just enough to keep it from feeling empty. This was the kind of supper made on busy nights, before chores, before church, before anyone had time to complain. Number 5. Sour cream noodles. In some households, especially among Eastern European families, there was always a small container tucked in the coldest corner of the icebox. Sour cream, plain, inexpensive, and often overlooked, waited there longer than most foods. On certain nights, it became the whole meal. Wide noodles would be cooked until tender, then drained and left steaming in the pot. A spoonful of sour cream was stirred in while everything was still hot, loosening into a smooth coating that clung to each ribbon. Sometimes a little butter joined it, sometimes just salt to bring it together. It worked because it turned very little into something that felt complete. No meat, no sauce, just warmth and enough richness to satisfy. The taste was gently tangy, the texture soft and silky without being heavy. This was often a quiet supper, eaten at the end of a long day, when stretching what you had mattered more than anything else. Number 6. Spaghetti with milk gravy. In parts of rural America, tomatoes weren't always waiting in the pantry. They came in season, and when they were gone, they were gone. But milk, when there was a cow nearby, was something families understood how to use. So spaghetti took a different path. The noodles were boiled as usual, soft and plain, then laid into a plate while a skillet worked beside them. A bit of saved fat warmed first, then flour stirred in until it thickened. Milk followed slowly, turning everything into a pale, smooth gravy with a heavy shake of black pepper. It worked because it replaced what wasn't there. No red sauce, no cheese, just a way to make pasta feel like a full meal. The texture was thick and coating, the flavor mild but comforting in its own way. For many families, this wasn't unusual at all. It was simply how spaghetti was supposed to taste. Number 7. Mock chicken noodle soup. There were days when someone at the table wasn't well, or the weather turned sharp and cold, and a warm bowl of soup felt necessary. But chicken wasn't always there to make it happen. So families found another way. A pot of water went on the stove, heated with a bouillon cube if one could be spared. An onion might be sliced in, maybe a carrot or a piece of celery if anything fresh remained. Then a handful of broken noodles was dropped in, softening as the broth took shape. It worked because it created the feeling of something richer than it was. A suggestion of chicken without the cost of it. The smell carried a gentle warmth, enough to fill a small kitchen and settle a restless stomach. This was the soup made when comfort mattered more than accuracy, when what people needed wasn't perfection, just something warm to hold on to. Number 8. Macaroni with stewed onions. Onions were one of the few things that almost never disappeared from the kitchen. Cheap, dependable, and able to last for weeks, they waited quietly until everything else ran out. And then they became the meal. Sliced thin and placed into a pan, the onions were cooked slowly, far longer than most people would expect. They softened, darkened, and slowly turned sweet, losing their sharpness as they broke down. When they were ready, they were poured over a bowl of hot macaroni, soaking into every curve. It worked because time replaced ingredients. What started as something simple became something deeper, almost rich, without adding anything extra. The smell was warm and slightly sweet, filling the room long before dinner was served. This was a patient kind of cooking, made on evenings when there was nowhere else to be and nothing else to use. Number 9. Lima beans and Noodles. Dried beans were the kind of food that stayed in the cupboard when everything else came and went. They didn't spoil quickly, and they could feed a family more than once if handled right. Lima beans in particular showed up often. They would be soaked overnight, then simmered slowly until soft, sometimes with a bit of onion, if one was available. Once they were ready, cooked noodles were folded in, letting the starch from both settle together into something thicker than expected. It worked because it stretched in two directions at once, protein from the beans, bulk from the noodles, a full pot that could last beyond a single meal. The texture leaned soft and hearty with a quiet creaminess that didn't need milk to exist. This was the kind of supper that stayed on the stove, ready for anyone who came back hungry later. Number 10. Macaroni salad. Not every meal during those years came from a hot stove. In the warmer months, when kitchens grew heavy with heat and fuel had to be saved, families turned to something cooler, something already made from what was left behind. Leftover macaroni rarely went to waste. It would be mixed with whatever could be found: a chopped egg, a bit of celery, maybe a spoonful of relish if there was a jar in the cupboard. A small amount of mayonnaise brought it together, just enough to bind everything into a single bowl. It worked because it reused what was already there. Nothing new had to be cooked, nothing extra had to be spent. The texture was soft with a slight crunch, the flavor mild but steady, easy to eat without much thought. This was often served in the evening, when the day's heat hadn't quite left the house, and a cold meal felt like the only sensible choice. Those meals were never meant to impress anyone. They were made quietly, out of habit, out of need, out of whatever happened to be left at the end of the week. And yet, they carried families through some of the hardest years most people would ever know. Today, they might seem too simple, maybe even a little strange. But there's something steady about them, something honest. Chances are, a few of these flavors haven't completely disappeared. They're still sitting somewhere in memory, on an old plate, at an old table. So I'm curious, which one of these would you actually try? And if this kind of story feels familiar to you, you can stay a while longer. There's more like it waiting.